Picture this, it's 2300 BCE, somewhere in what is now Iraq. A man who started life as an orphan, abandoned in a basket on a river, has just conquered every city-state in Mesopotamia. Not just conquered them, unified them, under one flag, for the first time in human history. No one had ever done this before, not because they didn't want to, because people genuinely didn't think it was possible. And here's what gets me. This empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. It had standardized trade, a professional standing army, an imperial postal system. All of this while your ancestors in Europe were still building the first stones of Stonehenge. This is the Akkadian Empire, the oldest empire on Earth. And for thousands of years, the world forgot it existed entirely. To understand what Sargon of Akkad pulled off, you have to understand what Mesopotamia looked like before him. Think of it like this. It was a map covered in tiny kingdoms, dozens of independent Sumerian city-states, Ur, Lagash, Kish, Nippur, all constantly at each other's throats. Every city had its own king, its own god, its own army.
There was no concept of Mesopotamia as a unified place, just a patchwork of people who happened to live near the same rivers. And then there's Sargon. We don't know his birth name. Sargon is an Akkadian title, meaning something close to true king or legitimate king, which is fascinating because everything about his early life suggests he was anything but. Ancient texts describe him as the son of a priestess who couldn't acknowledge him. She put him in a basket, sealed it with pitch, set it on the Euphrates. A man named Aki, a drawer of water, pulled him out and raised him. Sound familiar? This story predates Moses by over 1,000 years. Somehow, and we genuinely don't have all the details here, the records are fragmentary, Sargon worked his way up to become cupbearer to the king of Kish, a servant, a man who poured the king's wine. Not exactly the resume of a future world conqueror, but Kish was powerful, and Sargon was paying attention. Around 2334 BCE, give or take a few decades, early Mesopotamian dates are always a little fuzzy, Sargon made his move. He overthrew the king of Kish, and then he just kept going. City after city, king after king. The ancient texts say he fought 34 battles in his first campaigns alone.
Now here's what made Sargon different from every warlord before him. Previous conquerors would beat a city, loot it, and go home. Sargon didn't do that. He installed governors, Akkadian speakers loyal to him personally. He imposed a unified administration. He made Akkadian the official language of government across the entire region. He wasn't just winning wars, he was building a system. His capital, Akkad, and this is genuinely maddening to historians, has never been found. We know it existed. We have tablets describing it as one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world, and we have no idea where it is. Somewhere near modern Baghdad is the best guess, but the city that gave its name to the world's first empire is still literally lost. By the end of his campaigns, Sargon controlled territory stretching roughly 1,300 kilometers from the Persian Gulf up toward modern Syria and Turkey. The ancient texts claim he washed his weapons in the sea, a symbolic act, the ancient equivalent of planting a flag on the moon. He'd done something no human being had ever done, and he was just getting started. Sargon ruled for roughly 56 years. Let that sink in. The man who built the world's first empire also had one of the longest reigns of any ancient ruler. And during that time, the Akkadian Empire didn't just hold together, it flourished. Trade networks extended to the Indus Valley, to Egypt, to Anatolia. Merchants carried Mesopotamian grain, textiles, and copper across distances that would take months to travel. The Akkadians essentially invented long-distance imperial commerce. Some tablets record trade disputes, contracts, receipts, bureaucratic paperwork from 4,300 years ago that sounds almost modern in its mundane specificity. 2 talents of copper delivered by ship, witnessed. The administration was extraordinary. Sargon reportedly kept 5,400 men eating at his table daily. Ancient texts describe this as a sign of his court's size and power, though historians treat this as symbolic or exaggerated rather than a literal headcount. Still, the scale of Akkadian governance was genuinely unprecedented. They had inspectors, tax collectors, military governors, standardized weights and measures across the empire. But the most mind-blowing chapter, that belongs to Sargon's daughter. Her name was Enheduanna. She was appointed high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur, and she wrote hymns, sophisticated, deeply personal religious poetry that survived to this day. She is the first named author in human history, not the first writer, the first person we know by name who wrote something down and signed it. Think about that for a second. The oldest empire gave us the oldest known author, a woman, a princess priestess in 2300 BCE who wrote lines like, and I'm paraphrasing from translations here, "I, Enheduanna, will declare my prayers to you." She was exiled at one point during a rebellion, and her hymns describe that personal anguish with raw emotion. This isn't propaganda. This is literature.
Now, the empire's military peak. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, took things even further. He ruled around 2254 to 2218 BCE and expanded the empire to its greatest extent, possibly reaching into western Iran and parts of modern Turkey. He was so confident in his power, so convinced of his own greatness, that he did something no ruler before him had ever dared. He declared himself a god. Not just chosen by the gods, not son of a god, a living deity. He added the divine determinative symbol, a little cuneiform mark used only for gods, to his own name. He put it on his official inscriptions, his monuments, his stele. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, now in the Louvre, shows him literally stepping on his enemies while wearing a horned helmet, a symbol reserved exclusively for divine beings. No human king had ever claimed this, ever. For a while, it worked. Naram-Sin crushed a massive rebellion early in his reign. Ancient sources describe a coalition of kings rising against him, and he defeated them all. He rebuilt Akkad. He commissioned monumental art. The victory stele is genuinely beautiful, and it's 4,300 years old. But empires that declare themselves divine tend to attract a certain kind of cosmic irony. By the end of Naram-Sin's reign, something was changing, something the Akkadians couldn't fight with armies or administer away with bureaucracy. The sky was drying up.
Here's a term you might not know, the 4.2 kiloyear event. Around 2200 BCE, roughly 50 years after Naram-Sin's death, a severe drought hit the ancient Near East. And by severe, I mean catastrophic. Archaeological evidence at sites across the region shows a sudden abandonment of settlements in northern Mesopotamia. Analysis of lake sediments and soil cores in the area shows a dramatic spike in wind-blown dust around this period, evidence of arid conditions that persisted for potentially a century or more. This wasn't just a bad harvest season, this was a climate shift. The agricultural heartland of the Northern Empire essentially stopped producing food, and the Akkadians, already stretched thin across a massive territory, already dealing with a succession of weaker rulers after Naram-Sin, couldn't absorb the shock. The people began to move, southward, into the core of the empire. Ancient texts describe migrations of barbarian groups called the Gutians, coming down from the Zagros Mountains into Mesopotamian territory during the reign of Naram-Sin's successors. For a long time, historians blamed the Gutians entirely for the empire's collapse. The Mesopotamians certainly did, writing about them with real bitterness. But modern scholarship points to the climate collapse as the deeper cause. The Gutians were a symptom as much as a cause. People were moving because the land couldn't feed them.
The last Akkadian king, Sharkali-Shari, Naram-Sin's son, spent his reign fighting constant rebellions and invasions. An ancient king list asks, almost plaintively, who was king? Who was not king? It describes the chaos of this period with unusual candor. By around 2154 BCE, the dynasty had simply ceased to function. Akkad, that magnificent capital nobody can find, was sacked, looted, possibly burned. The empire that had taken Sargon decades to build dissolved within a generation or two of Naram-Sin's death. And here's what hits hardest. The Mesopotamians who came after, the Sumerians who briefly revived under the third dynasty of Ur, the later Babylonians, they looked back on Naram-Sin's declaration of godhood as the cause of the empire's fall. They wrote lament texts about the destruction of Akkad, framing it as divine punishment for Naram-Sin's arrogance. He offended the gods, so the gods sent the Gutians. Whether you read that as theology or just as human beings trying to make sense of catastrophic loss, there's something deeply recognizable about it. When the unthinkable happens, people need a reason.
They need the story to mean something. In a single century, the world's first empire went from stretching across the known world to not existing at all.
So, why did history forget them? Part of it is archaeology. Akkad is still lost, which means we don't have a central dig site the way we do for Egypt or Greece. Part of it is that later empires, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, built on Akkadian foundations so completely that the origins got buried under the grandeur of what came after. The Akkadian language itself survived as the lingua franca of the ancient Near East for another 1,000 years after the empire's fall. People were still writing in Akkadian in 500 BCE, they just forgot to credit the source. What remains is scattered but extraordinary. The victory stele of Naram-Sin sits in the Louvre, and Enheduanna's hymns survive in cuneiform tablets spread across museums. Fragments of Sargon's legend were still being copied by scribes 1,500 years after his death. He became a kind of mythological figure, the ultimate self-made king, and the blueprint, the idea of empire, that you could unify disparate peoples under one administration, one law, one currency, one language. That idea came from here. Every empire that came after, consciously or not, was working from the Akkadian model.
Makes you wonder how much else is buried out there, doesn't it? What other civilizations built something extraordinary, watched it fall, and got swallowed by the silence of time? Because here's the thing about the Akkadians. For most of modern history, we weren't even sure they were real. It took 20th century archaeology to confirm it. One empire, genuinely the first, and we almost forgot it happened. That's the story of Akkad. And honestly, the fact that we're talking about it at all feels like a small miracle. Drop a comment and tell me which forgotten empire I should cover next. And if you want something equally insane, next time we're looking at an empire that controlled the largest contiguous landmass in African history and disappeared so completely that most people have never heard its name.